I mentioned in class that an outline for a paper like this can take many different forms. It's not set just like a basic 5-paragraph essay. However, there are a couple approaches that you could take, models that you could apply to your own paper. So I'll go over a couple of those, as well as I've provided a couple example introductions from previous students' papers, so you can kind of see how students have situated their definitions in order to craft an argument. So items that may be, or I should say, most likely going to be included are that claim involving a question, problem, or challenge of a definition, a general definition of some key concepts, what needs to be defined within your paper in order to make sense of your definitions, or there are key terms that might need to be defined as well. A careful look at subject in terms of general definitions, so looking at maybe like Webster's Dictionary and what's there, if a community or mission statement has something that's related, what does that state? Evidence for every part of the alternative views and counter-arguments. So what does your counter-argument say? What are stereotypes that are disproved? What would the opposition have to say there? Okay, and kind of taking that, not just stating it, but taking it into consideration in order to refute it or argue against it. And a conclusion that draws out the implications of the argument, so kind of the bigger picture here. This, when you get to the conclusion, it's when you're moving your argument out into the rest of the world. So what does that mean? So here's one example outline where you use the introduction as you typically would. You are creating the context, you are providing that background information, you are stating the claim, i.e. thesis statement. From there, then you're moving it into your presentation of criteria. What are all of your criteria? Just kind of developing, not just stating, but stating and developing that criteria. This could be several paragraphs. Respond to any counter arguments. And then moving into how your definition does or does not fit into those criteria, really developing that argument. Then finally moving into that conclusion. Summing up your argument, kind of looking at the big picture, answering that so what question, and ending with something memorable, right? Kind of moving it out into the real world. Another example would be to do the same thing in that introduction, setting up the context and background, setting up kind of what's at stake here, providing that thesis statement or claim, and then doing criteria and match. So here you would do, here's criteria 1 and how it does or does not fit. Here's criteria 2 and how it does or does not fit. So instead of stating all the criteria and then all of the ways it does or doesn't match as the previous one, these are just 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. Following that into counter-arguments, objections, things along those lines, and then finally ending up again with your conclusion by summing up, big picture, answering so what, and moving back out into the world. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't set in stone. You do not have to follow either one of these models, but if you're really stuck, it might be a good way to kind of start out. Some people, their paper's not going to be as heavily explicitly focused on criteria. Other people's, it will be heavily and explicitly focused on criteria. This doesn't mean that you don't have criteria. You do have criteria. Just some people are going to be like, one of the first parameters are, right? And other people, it will be a more organic and natural flow to it. So how you decide to actually outline and set up your paper is up to you. Here are 2 samples that you can try and work with if you feel that you need the assistance. Now let's go ahead and look at some sample introductions. These are examples from previous student papers and previous semesters. I've taken all names off of the papers. And if you look at them, you're going to notice a wide variety of ways and approaches in order to do this. None of these papers are 100%, but these are a good example of the variety and approaches that you can take and how to start setting up your argument. So the first example here is talking about introverts. This student sets up the topic with a more personable tone. It's not as highly academic as some other papers are. There's definitely the second person that's deployed throughout the paper. I strongly against not necessarily using the second person. we always wonder, who's this we? Who is you that you are speaking to? But for a paper like this, it can fall into that second person tone. I would just say be careful about doing it and do so rhetorically. Now you'll notice that the student also asks several rhetorical questions right in the middle of the introduction. Rhetorical questions are great when limited. Oftentimes one or two for an entire paper is enough. Try not to fall into the slippery slope of quite a few rhetorical questions because at a certain point it loses its impact and your readers want to know answers. They no longer become rhetorical. It becomes set up for you to further develop. This student talks about hip hop. Their paper looks at a number of examples in order to talk about the actual influence of hip hop, taking it out of the more stereotypical negative connotations that hip hop has, talking about things like conscious rap, moving into movements and the history of rap and hip hop and where it comes from. This essay actually takes a more academic tone, especially as the student dives further and further into the paper. In their discussion of hip hop, they talk about it as more than a simple base kind of entertainment, but talks about how it's actually very complex, both in how it's written, the messages that it conveys, the community that it builds, and more. This student talks about the difference between being mischievous and malicious, and sets up the argument in a way that's saying we often think of mischievous as malicious, or malicious actually as mischievous, but it's really setting the dichotomy that it is not this. It is not malicious. This is a more personal testimony. It does use the first person, but it's very limited actually throughout the paper of how they use first person. Here it's definitely setting up because the student did some first person or primary research. They went out and did some surveys, so to incorporate that, they did have to place themselves within the paper. They also use some personal examples, but it's also, all of that information is surrounded by hard research and secondary research. So again, it's not necessarily the narrative here, but there are sections where some first-person account does move in. This student talks about the stereotypes surrounding the Samoa people and the Samoan culture, and sets up with some of the stereotypes that are held out there, and then works through the paper by dispelling them in order to actually at the end come together with a conclusion of what it actually means to be Samoan and what that looks like from an insider point of view versus the outsider point of view. So even though this person is very situated within this community, you can see how it has kind of more of an academic tone, so it's not necessarily that narrative element that's in there. So they were able to maintain kind of a distance by still making a really strong and compassionate argument about what it means to be an insider in the Samoan community. So this is an interesting approach on what it means to be an animal lover or a person who's compassionate towards animals. And it seems like a really simple topic, but they make the issue more complex by looking at it from an Eastern and Western philosophical, religious standpoint. And so it kind of goes through and breaks down what does that mean and what does it mean in the big picture. So it's not necessarily just as simple as saying that you love animals, but taking it several steps further, and also pushes back towards some of the more popular organizations about what it means to be an animal lover. This student talks about being a believer in public lands, but really what it's talking about is being a user in public lands and being integrated within public lands. There are some first-person uses in this, in the first paragraph, but really drops into some heavy-hitting research looking at statistics and numbers and facts. When we move into that visual argument, we're going to look at this paper and the video that goes along with this a little more closely. So we'll see how the paper has more of an academic tone, but the visual argument that the student made turns into something that is way more personal. So as you're thinking about your paper now, and you're thinking about how this is something that you really hold and believe and are, how do I make that more kind of academic, definitional, argumentative? Know that there will be time for a more narrative tone and a narrative quality when we move into the visual aspect of this. Now, don't start worrying about that yet, but just to let you know as you're sitting down thinking about writing, that there are going to be times later in future projects for you to use that first person. Again, for this paper, it's not a narrative, so if you use first person, there should be a specific and clear reason why you are using it. And again, this should be more kind of academic, not necessarily a narrative. All right, so hopefully these examples help by kind of looking at them and thinking about where you can take your paper. And as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask.